You're listening to AudioMag, Magazines Canada's podcast. I'm Melanie Rutledge, Executive Director at Magazines Canada, and I'm here today with Shirlee Engel, Public Affairs Counsellor at Compass Rose Group in Ottawa. Shirlee is a seasoned multi-platform media and communication strategist with more than 15 years of experience, specializing in storytelling, media relations, crisis communications, and public policy. Shirlee has a passion for building relationships and helping great organizations and businesses navigate the noise to get the traction and attention they deserve. And I have to say, I am also a huge fan of Shirlee's. I remember her star reporting back on Global News. So it's great to have the opportunity to speak with you, Shirlee, about the outcomes of the recent federal election and what it might all mean for Canadian magazines. I know that our listeners will get a lot out of our conversation today. And just a point about that, our discussion will be more of a conversation today on the podcast instead of a straight up Q&A. So thanks so much for coming today, Shirlee.
Thanks so much for having me, Melanie. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So let's get right into it. There's been so much happening on Parliament Hill. It's dizzying, isn't it? Since the federal election back in October, that it almost seems like a lifetime ago.
Totally.
But before we dive into the election and post-election, I'd like to start by discussing the election campaign because it's important context for the rest of the discussion. So first off, what were some of the themes that you saw coming out of this election, Shirlee?
Well, it does feel like ages ago now, trying to rack my brain looking back. There was really no big idea in the campaign from the Liberals or the Conservatives. We saw very granular policies like planting 2 billion trees, helping kids go to camp, lower cell phone fees. A lot of people called this an election about nothing or a Seinfeld election, a throwing spaghetti at the wall election. The parties tried to frame it as who has the best plan to make life better for you. They emphasized what their bases wanted to hear, and affordability was a key policy theme. The Conservatives actually framed a whole campaign around it. We saw lowering cell phone bills and taxing web giants as real populist consumer issues meant to appeal to undecided voters. But we also saw other broad themes come up like racism, cultural values, Bill 21 in Quebec, climate change, and of course, national unity, which we're still talking a lot about, Wexit. And then, of course, pharmacare, which we're going to be looking for in this new parliament. We also saw a lot of negativity in the campaign. So this level of vitriol that we hadn't seen in a long time, the highest in recent memory. And it was often devoid of any substantive policy discussion. There was a lot of mudslinging. It was a very divisive, hard-fought campaign. And the war rooms worked really hard to discredit their opponents, as they always do. But the media really seemed to spend a lot of time reporting on what the war rooms dug up. And the leaders of the two main parties spent a lot of time on the defensive. We, of course, had the blackface, brownface controversy with Justin Trudeau, which really was a turning point in the campaign for him and made for a very difficult period heading into the crucial debates. And for Andrew Scheer, the inability to get past questions about same-sex marriage and abortion, questions about his dual citizenship and previous career in the insurance industry, accusations that he fudged his resume. And it ultimately started him on a downward spiral that he just couldn't course correct. And it ended with his resignation as party leader amid revelations that party funds were going towards his kids' private school education. And even though he actually increased the Conservative seat count, won the popular vote, and reduced Justin Trudeau's Liberals to a minority, he's going down in history as a very ineffective leader.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, it's been a number of weeks since the election now, but I got to tell you, Andrew Scheer's resignation and the search watching the Conservatives select a new leader is going to be one of the most important stories, I think, to kind of emerge post-election. And it's one that I think a lot of people are going to be watching really, really carefully.
For sure.
So speaking of themes that define the campaign, we did see that misinformation or fake news played a part in the 2019 campaign. Do you see it continuing to be an issue?
Absolutely. I mean, there was lots of misinformation in the election, and we expected that, and it was coming from all parties. And a lot of the misinformation was on Facebook through these ads targeted to specific voters on very specific issues. And we've seen this in other countries. So in Canada, the Conservatives were targeting Chinese Canadians on legalizing hard drugs. Liberals on the gun control issue, they ran ads claiming a Conservative win would lead to assault rifles spreading through the streets. And there were controversies about that. Overall, the federal government was actually watching for this. They knew it was coming. They did detect attempted misinformation during the campaign, but none of it met the threshold to compromise the election or alert the public. We do know that there's a panel releasing an unclassified public version of the report in the spring. So that'll be interesting to watch. But I do see it for sure continuing to be an issue. It's kind of like a runaway train at the moment worldwide, and there's really no way to stop it. I think the best thing Canadians can do is just be really vigilant about the sources of the news they're consuming, and always check other sources. If you read or hear something that makes you go, huh? Just kind of do that gut check. And at the same time, I think as people become more aware of fake news, they're more likely to spot it. So you come to expect it now as you read through the news, and you have hopefully a better sense of what may or may not be true. But it does remain a risk, I think, for the occasional news consumer, or someone who's not as plugged in to the day-to-day, or maybe doesn't have the time or inclination to dig deeper into something that might seem a bit off. And then there's, of course, that echo chamber problem of people wanting to consume information that they really want to believe. So that's interesting. But we've also seen studies show that as misinformation becomes a more common phenomenon, consumers of news are turning again to more traditional sources like magazines. And I know, Melanie, you actually wrote an op-ed in the Hill Times about this recently.
That is true. And it's interesting to note that as a society, as we continue to struggle with what's just a complete overload of disinformation and misinformation, it's interesting that magazines do find themselves in a pretty unique position, precisely because of their commitment to the integrity of the information that they communicate to their readers. Certainly, we know that there is deep thoughtful research that magazines perform when they're gathering a story. Journalists, contributors, etc. They research scrupulously. They edit scrupulously, and there's a great deal of fact checking that goes on as well. So we know that this registers with readers, and is certainly one of the reasons why people do trust magazines. But I also think that there's a really strong sense of brand equity with magazines as well. There are, a lot of well-known Canadian magazine brands that Canadian readers trust, and so it's sort of like when you see your favorite magazine, it's like a good housekeeping seal of approval. I think one can argue that magazines almost serve as an antidote to fake news and misinformation.
Definitely.
And in fact, there was an Ipsos survey in May of 2019 that suggested that 7 in 10 Canadians, in fact, say that they trust and have confidence in traditional news media, which would include magazines, when it comes to reporting the news fully, accurately, and fairly. And that's actually up 7 points since 2018.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And we also saw that magazines and their websites scored high in a survey last year by consumer research companies Vividata and Kantar on trustworthiness in news. And that's in great contrast to a rather low confidence rating for social media. So absolutely, when it comes to delivering trusted news coverage, more than 8 in 10 respondents, in fact, said that their trust in print and digital magazines has stayed the same or increased, and that's among the highest ratings among all media outlets.
Oh.
So I'm curious, Shirlee, what are some of the opportunities that Canadian magazines have as Canadian consumers turn more and more, or perhaps return to traditional media sources?
Well, as a former journalist, I'm happy to hear that, because I know that's something that a lot of journalists, toiling away, worry about, that, is what we're doing relevant. And, I think that shows that it very much still is. And I think that the credibility of traditional media sources is extremely important, and it's something that magazines can certainly leverage. I think the key is going to be making sure to reach audiences where they are these days, and making sure to follow them onto those digital platforms. And very much online is where people exist and where they consume their information. So the key is continuing to innovate in that digital sphere ear and trying to find interesting new ways to tell stories that draw people in and discourage them from going to a lot of the clickbait that we see out there these days. So, the way you tell a story is sometimes just as important as the story itself. The more visual you can make it these days, given short attention spans and wanting to catch attention, the more we can explore ways to draw audiences in these new and interesting ways, I think is very much where the magazine industry needs to be going. While at the same time, maintaining that in-depth, the integrity that magazines have always been known for.
Couldn't agree with you more. And we could talk about this all afternoon.
I
Goodness
know.
gracious. But I would like to turn to the post-election landscape now. So we have a minority government. We've had one for several weeks. It's been a super busy season on Parliament Hill. I can't believe the election was only October 21st.
I know.
But since then we've had a cabinet swearing in. We've had a throne speech. We've had parliamentary secretaries named. We've had ministers' mandate letters published and released to the public. And that's all before the holidays.
An economic update.
Yes, that's right. We had the economic update. So obviously, lots of infrastructure in government, and I think we could probably talk a little bit about how it's all the same things that still happen, but in terms of the running of government, there are some really important differences between a minority government and a majority government. What are some of the different dynamics in play in a minority situation, and what do you think we should be on the lookout for, Shirlee?
Yeah, it's definitely a very different dynamic. And I think even for a lot of the staffers in the Liberal government, a lot of them have never experienced life in a minority situation.
True.
I covered the minority governments under Stephen Harper and majority government, and it's a very different animal. You proceed in a very different way, whether you're in government, following government, interacting with government, covering government. And there's some really key differences. It's a much more complicated situation, and it's much more complicated to get things done in that environment. So there's a lot of jockeying behind the scenes. I remember spending a lot of time camped outside the House Leader's office. At the time, it was Peter Van Loan under Stephen Harper. And, in a majority, nobody cares about the House Leader, but in a minority, all of a sudden that person is so critical in making sure, to try to get people on side and to really have those backroom talks to get consensus that you don't normally see in a majority where governments can pursue their own agendas. So that also presents an opportunity for stakeholders who want to be heard, because of course the opposition matters more, as do backbench MPs and critics and people who otherwise would sort of be shouting from the rooftops in a majority situation. We saw in the throne speech on December 5th and in the minister mandate letters a very different tone when it comes to how the Liberals are approaching this mandate. Of course, not all columnists have agreed, and there's some debate about that, but for the most part, it's a more conciliatory tone about working together, trying to understand regional differences. We got a real glimpse of the government's priorities when the ministers' mandate letters were released. So it'll be interesting to see how they work collaboratively across party lines to try to get some of the big ticket items passed. Of course, one of the biggest unknowns, Melanie, is how long the government will last, because we know the average lifespan of a minority government is about 2 years. But given the turmoil in the Conservative Party at the moment and the fact that nobody is in any mood to go back to the polls, it's anyone's guess how long this parliament will last. The Liberals do have a pretty strong minority with 157 seats, and no one's really in the mood or the financial shape to go back to the polls anytime soon. I think it's also worth noting the compressed timeline in these early months of the new government for anyone trying to, engage the government or MPs in a substantial way. The House is actually only sitting for 15 and a half weeks, if you think about it, between when they come back at the end of January to when the House rises in June. So that's really not a whole lot of time to get things done, especially when you think of the budget coming up so quickly within a few weeks of that. So there's really a lot of shifting priorities in a minority, and it also means that the government doesn't have total control like they did before.
They don't have they don't have total control, and they certainly don't have a lot of time, right? 15 and a half weeks is just like the blink of an eye. I kind of shiver when I think about everything I want to try to get done before June. I better get going right now.
And you should also be realistic about what you want to get done. I mean, coming in with a big laundry list is not going to work this time around.
That's absolutely right. I mean, we always talk about how we need to be very strategic and very targeted in our asks. No matter what shape of government you're engaging with. But certainly, you make a very good point that in a minority situation, you've got to chisel those asks even more, make them so finely wrought and finely tuned. I mean, I really wouldn't go in with more than one or two, maybe three maximum.
At the most, yeah.
And then you've got to have your sort of elevator speech ready to go. I am glad that you brought up the ministerial mandate letters, though. I'm interested specifically in the direction given to the new Minister of Canadian Heritage, Stephen Guilbeault.
Yeah, and he's a newcomer to government and a real wild card. A lot of people are really watching him closely. In his mandate, interesting for the sector, he has a specific line to support local journalism and develop business models that facilitate private giving and philanthropic support for professional journalism and local news. So I thought that was interesting because, as we know, working in journalism for a long time, it was always about monetizing content and finding new ways to bring some money into the system to allow journalists to do their work without compromising the integrity or objectivity. And that's always been a challenge and continues to be one. So this was a very broad kind of blanket statement. And obviously there's not really any meat on the bones there. How he's going to go about doing that, we'll see. We do know there are some models already that exist, where private giving and support has helped some brand new outfits get off the ground. So that'll be interesting to see. In terms of Canadian content, we saw some strong language about that, which, is going to be important, especially, and I know we're going to talk a little bit later about the Bloc Québécois, but making sure that, Francophone Canadians and Quebecers feel that they are reflected in the content that comes out of content creators in Canada, and also just what the government funds. The other interesting thing was also, in addition to the Canadian content, when you look at the digital sphere, there's a real whole focus on digital in this government. There's a minister of digital government right now. But it was really a push about the privacy aspect of things. And if you think to the Cambridge Analytica scandal and, all of this controversy about Facebook and how much data they collect, and even during this past election, I got some mailings to my house where I thought, wait, how do they know this about me? This is kind of creepy, from different parties. And so really enhanced powers for the privacy commissioner, new sets of online rights, giving consumers a little bit more control, you'd hope. And it's very difficult to do, and I'm watching to see exactly how they do it, but better protecting people's personal data and giving people more of a window into how that data is used. Creating new regulations for the digital marketplace, a new data commissioner overseeing these new regulations. And then, of course, one of the real populist ones in the campaign was ensuring that the multinational tech giants like Netflix, Facebook, Google, that they all pay their fair share of tax. And that's been a really big thing for all the parties. And in Quebec in particular, there's really been a lot of talk about that. But there were some really good opportunities as far as if you look at it through the lens of the magazine sector. And I know, Melanie, you were looking at those letters very closely through that lens.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, just to, we spoke a little bit in terms of sort of general government relations and engaging with different MPs and senators, et cetera, et cetera. There's, obviously you need to work the opposition parties. You need to work the parliamentary committees. You need to work with parliamentary secretaries who are going to have some more enhanced powers in this particular government. You really need to, it doesn't matter what political party you're dealing with, you need to build and burnish those relationships on both sides of the aisle in the House. All of that goes without saying. I think it's even more so in a minority situation. Yes, there are certainly some I would say ongoing opportunities for magazines in terms of recommendations that we want to make and things that we want to get done. Obviously, with a new power dynamic and a new government, there's an opportunity to nurture new champions for your file, sort of the magazine caucus, if you will. So that's something that we'll be looking very hard at. And then, we have our tried and true tropes, if you will, that do carry weight. The uniquely Canadian perspective that Canadian magazines offer, published in both official languages as well as Indigenous languages and many, many others. There are Canadian magazines published in nearly every provincial and territorial jurisdiction on virtually any subject matter you could think of. We like to say, whatever your passion or hobby, we've got a magazine for that, and we really do.
Yeah, totally.
So there's that uniquely Canadian perspective, and it's a perspective that is increasingly sought on the world stage as well, which is a nice feather in our cap. We talked about climate change, and the new Minister for Canadian Heritage, of course, is a very interesting figure, as you mentioned, Shirlee, with his background. He's an environmentalist, and certainly, is going to fight for that file around the cabinet table as well, even though he's in charge of a different portfolio. And I think, again, I think magazines have made great strides in their stewardship responsibilities towards the environment and on the recycling file. We print on recycled paper, ancient forest friendly, and I think that with the growing interest in banning certain types of materials, single-use plastics, for example, it's not paper, but you see the federal government, even though recycling and stewardship is a provincial jurisdiction, you do see the federal government sort of taking steps in that direction from a policy perspective. So I think magazines can really leverage that. Certainly in terms of working on digital platforms, more and more, it's helped us drastically reduce our carbon footprint as an industry, and I would say that magazine publishers take their environmental responsibilities very seriously, and recycling print, certainly in making sure that fees that are paid for recycling are reasonable across various provincial jurisdictions. That has, in fact, become a pretty significant area of advocacy for the industry. So climate change and the environment, a kind of a pretty interesting file for us as well. And then there are, of course, the ones that we, the other files that we often talk about, such as job creation. There are some 15,000 Canadians coast to coast to coast employed at a Canadian magazine. The industry contributes $1.7 billion annually to the GDP of the country. And the jobs, these are digital economy jobs, right? These are knowledge economy, digital first jobs. So it's a really important point to mention as well. And we want to make sure that we preserve those jobs for the industry and that we grow them. And then, of course, the challenge that all media organizations are struggling with today and continue to grapple with, whether you're a newspaper or a magazine, or and that's, again, making that deft but difficult transition from print to digital. And really, certainly for magazines, occupying both those spaces at the same time. And we know that magazines have been working in the digital sphere for well over a decade, 2008, even before that. But the reality is, in order to monetize digital content, but to be loyal and to be true to the legacy of print and the important role that print still plays, and I think will continue to play, the challenging reality from a resource perspective is that magazine publishers need to publish in all spaces all the time. Lots lots of key points to raise with parliamentarians as we engage, and we're really looking forward to doing it. We talked about those digital jobs, and we know that jobs are clear across the country. We talked about how magazines publish in all jurisdictions. So the regions are really important. And we were talking a little bit earlier about parliamentary secretaries, and we know that there are regional parliamentary secretaries as well. And I think that they might play an interesting role here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the Economic Development and Official Languages Minister, Melanie actually is being supported by 6 regional parliamentary secretaries, 1 per regional development agency. And then we also know that in Minister Freeland's office, Chrystia Freeland, who's the new Deputy Prime Minister and Intergovernmental Affairs is also in her portfolio, she's going to have prominent regional desks staffed by senior people to advise her and assume part of the role that was previously held by the Prime Minister's office. And these changes really reflect the regional importance of Minister Freeland's role and her leadership on the National Unity File. So in addition to those people, as well as those parliamentary secretaries, I mean, they're going to be important players in this government, especially from a government relations approach. The parliamentary secretaries actually have more power in committees this time around. The Liberals have changed the rules back to the way things used to be, allowing parliamentary secretaries to once again act as substitutes, move motions, and cast votes. And, in majority situations, we often see them as, they do the duties that the ministers don't want to have to do. And they're sort of like ministers in waiting, hoping that if they are good soldiers and toe the party line and work hard, that they can be considered for future ministerial posts. But in this parliament, they'll be very interesting players to engage. And it'll be very important in any outreach plan to target parliamentary secretaries as well, especially when it comes to when you talk about those regional magazines. Different parts of the country may have very specific regional asks or right, focuses. And, you're not necessarily going to go to the minister for a lot of those things, and they could become very, very important allies.
Well, yeah, exactly. And basically, it's engage with everybody on the Hill all the time.
Talk to everybody.
That's pretty much what it is. And another group that I'd love to get your take on is the Senate, of course. How do you see the role of the Senate playing out with the new minority government?
Well, it's interesting. The role of the Senate could become bigger and more influential, given, as we know, its very independent makeup. Keep in mind, they'll still be there when the government fails. And so it's important to build and maintain relationships there if they don't already exist from before. The Senate is really interesting lately in that it's become increasingly more and more independent. And this is something that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau himself began in his first term when he changed the process for naming senators, and they're now named by an arm's length advisory board, and there are no more Liberal senators. They were kicked out of the caucus in 2014, and at the time the Prime Minister said he wanted senators to provide nonpartisan input on federal policy. But what that means is that there's really no way to know at this point how these nonpartisan senators will respond to what is coming out of the House of Commons. Traditionally, political parties appointed senators and counted on them to help push legislation through. They were actually called by reporters, flax hacks and bagmen. It was almost like an insult, like, oh, appoint, so-and-so who is good to you in this election or helped you in this way politically. It's not like that anymore. And that could make things much more difficult. There could be more amendments from senators. There could be more changes. But on the other hand, from a more positive point of view, the Senate can also help move things along, especially when it comes to private members' bill. And we actually saw that in December with a bill to help improve support for jurors that are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health issues. This was a bill, a private member's bill that was in the House. It died on the order paper with the previous Parliament, and a senator recently introduced it. And the reason for that is because it can expedite the process. If it's a private member, they actually have to wait for a lottery system to get their bills considered. But if it's introduced in the Senate and the Senate passes the legislation, it goes back to the House and the process is a lot faster than if, the MP waited to introduce it in the House first. So all that to say, it'll be very interesting to see how senators' roles evolve and how they interact with the House. And of course, from an outreach perspective, it's very important to consider senators as part of the plan as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I'd much rather, work and engage with an active Senate than what it used to be, or at least the way it used to be perceived. So
Hmm.
I think this is good news.
Hmm.
We've talked a lot about the opportunities that a minority government presents us with. Let's talk a little bit about the risks, though. What do you see that stands out as a risk in a minority government?
Well, obviously, the first thing is that short lifespan. You just don't know how long the minority government's going to be in place, and that means less time to deliver on priorities. Parties are laser focused on their specific priorities, and they're also in perpetual election campaign mode. So even though, they're saying publicly that they want to make things work and that they want to work with the government, and it just the reality is they're all just waiting for that next campaign, and everything they do is being put through that lens so that later on when they go to the electorate, they want to make sure that they've got a track record to run on, and that they didn't do anything that could sort of shoot them in the foot in that regard. From a stakeholder perspective, that means you could get lost in the shuffle, especially if your issues don't align with the government or opposition's immediate priorities. And that's why we tell clients, like, it's so important to have that, as you talked about, that climate change lens, because we do know that that's a really big push in this government. We
Mm-hmm.
also know that that middle class lens, the affordability lens, is so important. And if you look at the mandate letters, that was a theme through all the letters. And so you really have to make sure that you focus your priorities through those lenses, or at least take a look at your priorities and try to find ways to at least be able to address those things. So, I mean, it is a risk if you don't have a plan that way. And even though we saw, of course, in the recent economic statement that the finance minister, Bill Morneau, had an optimistic outlook for the economy, we know in any government, turbulence in the economy, a downturn, an unexpected event, which often those events are out of Canada's control, could further hurt the magazine industry and the economy in general, and lead to job losses, renew calls for help. And then we also know the regional tensions, which we haven't talked a lot about. We mentioned at the beginning, but the rise of the so-called Wexit movement and this whole Western alienation debate that has been ignited since the election. And that has really sucked a lot of oxygen in the news cycle, and also a lot of attention. We know from a stakeholder perspective, we saw even in the throne speech, there was a lot talked about, not just what was in there to address regional tensions, but also what wasn't in there caused a lot of controversy as well. So from a stakeholder perspective, it's difficult to cut through that noise and get heard when everybody's attention is focused elsewhere. That's not to say that just because the media is consumed with something, that behind the scenes you can't have productive conversations, but it's just something to keep in mind when you look at your strategy and how you're approaching things. And of course, we know that since it's a minority government, the government itself no longer has complete control over the legislative agenda, which means that policy and program changes, things like that, could be delayed. It's not always up to the government, when things are done and how they get done.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right there. There's a lot of noise out there, and there's a very, very short timeline. And I agree that you can have extremely productive conversations behind the scenes and in the back rooms, but a lot of the time people aren't focused, right? They're focused on Wexit or another issue or alienation of some type, as you were discussing. So it is important to have your asks be really, really focused and be ready to go. And the other thing I think is key is to, as you said, Shirley, to really parse those mandate letters and pay close attention to the policy zeitgeist, if I may use that term. What are the high level themes and key messages that the government wants to see traction on and see movement on? And then you look at your policy bucket, if you will, and I always try to sort of hang them on to the larger policy directions that we know the government's going in. And that changes from government to government. But the days of going in and, you hear stories of people who would go in and, stakeholders from one group or another would go in and bang their fist on the table and, make these demands, and this is what we want and this is why. And, I've heard, petrifying stories of people going in back in the day and might have worked decades ago when we were in a different time, a different phase as a country. But I know from experience that that is categorically not how you get policy and program changes done today. You absolutely have to be seen to be working in tandem with a government's broader policy goals. So our, one of the, I would say, one of our marquee programs that is absolutely critical to the Canadian magazine sector. Well, there are two actually at the federal level. One is the Canada Council for the Arts, which of course has a marvelous program in support of art and literary magazines. And so those members of ours receive extremely important support from the Canada Council. The other jewel in the crown, I would say, federally from a support perspective for the industry is, of course, the Canada Periodical Fund. And this is annual funding. It gives publishers a kind of baseline of predictable support. If you think of a piece of music, there's that baseline funding, and you can use the melody to experiment in the digital space to try to innovate and try to monetize, right? So we are expecting and waiting on changes to the Canada Periodical Fund. In fact, the important modernizing of the CPF that began a number of years ago in response to a program review that in fact took place in 2014, 2015. But absolutely, ever since the election was called, we've been messaging diligently to our members to, hang on, the campaign will delay things, and then when the new minister is named, there will be another delay because the minister needs to bone up on the files, and we'll have very legitimate questions, about a number of the files. And then to add a third layer on top of that in a minority situation, as you've so articulately discussed today on AudioMag with us, it just adds another level of complexity, a short time span, a lot of background noise, a lot of issues that dominate the agenda that aren't necessarily your issues. So for our members, I think everybody needs to know that we're working diligently, but also people need to recognize and understand that the type of situation we're actually working in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I got to turn back to my favorite story of the last couple of days or the last week. I really want to talk to you about Andrew Scheer, of course, and how is his resignation going to affect the minority government? Does it put the government in a stronger position, or could a new leader, when that person is named, make things harder for the Liberals?
Well, I think in the short term, absolutely, the Liberals are going to get a free ride. I mean, the Conservatives have been sent into a period of internal turmoil, which will affect how it operates in Parliament. There's lots of behind the scenes jockeying, candidates emerging, all the speculation, who's going to run, who's entered the race, who's in the wings. And it's really, a lot of internal sort of ugly debates that were going on behind the scenes have now been sort of laid bare, and you've kind of pulled the curtain open on a lot of the divisions within the party, which is never a good thing for a party to come across that way. And obviously for the Liberals, I mean, when there's so much attention on Andrew Scheer and the leadership race, and look at the party, they're in shambles, they don't have their act together, the Liberals can just continue on, and they know that they don't need the Conservatives to pass legislation, and they just get on with things. The party itself, the Conservatives, we know, are in the midst of an identity crisis, especially when it comes to social issues. And we know in this election campaign, the progressive values very much resonated with Canadians, and Canadians largely rejected a lot of the social conservatism that we've seen. And that was a large part of what a lot of people believe led to the downfall of Andrew Scheer as leader. I think so in the short term, definitely a good thing for the Liberals in the sense that it's a distraction, but that's only as long as Andrew Scheer remains the leader. And that's when the focus will be on him, what people think he did wrong, internal divisions, and not Justin Trudeau. What could be a game changer is if they get a strong interim leader that can very much change the channel, unite the party, at least publicly, and sort of start moving things forward. There's a lot of talk about, how former interim leader Rona Ambrose led the party so well after Stephen Harper. And she was widely regarded as a very strong and capable leader. And so does someone like that take over? Is it a woman, for instance? A lot of, who succeeds will be very interesting. I think one of the biggest question marks is we know that Andrew Scheer has talked about staying on, but a lot of people wonder how that's possible. Months and months and months of this. How effective can the party be in the House of Commons with this sort of cloud hanging over it? And if it's this long, drawn-out, acrimonious leadership race that divides the party along social lines and even more, that's really not good for the party either. So I think definitely as the House comes back and as we see the coming months and into the budget season, it'll be very important to try to somehow move past that. But as long as Andrew Scheer remains leader, it'll be very difficult.
It's going to be really, really hard for them to change the channel as long as he hangs around, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh boy, very interesting. But we also need to talk about the Bloc Québécois. We know certainly from a cultural angle for all arts and culture stakeholders, but also for magazines, we know that they're a very big player in this parliament. What kind of impact do you think this might have on the Canadian magazine sector? And are there opportunities here with the rise of the Bloc, given the party's laser focus on Quebec arts and culture?
Absolutely. I think you nailed it there. I mean, think about it. There are 22 new Bloc MPs in the House, and we already know that at least a few of them could be potential champions for the sector, especially when it comes to matters of official languages, of Canadian content, and things that are generally good for Quebec are things that the Bloc likes. So the Bloc is actually a very important player in the balance of power in this parliament. The Liberals are only 13 seats shy of a majority, so they only need 13 votes to pass legislation, and will often turn to the Bloc Québécois to do that. And we saw that happen with the throne speech. Leader Yves-François Blanchet said that he saw ways in it to make gains for Quebec, and that probably wasn't an accident. We know it wasn't. And so, is there enough in there to, get the Bloc on side and help make Parliament work, as we know Mr. Blanchet has said he wants to do? As long as there's no poison pill, it could be workable. So the Bloc has a lot of power in this Parliament when it comes to that, and you can be sure that wherever possible, when the Liberals know they can't count on the NDP or even in some cases the Conservatives, they'll definitely want to make sure that the Bloc can see something they like in pieces of legislation. An important thing to keep in mind as well is emphasizing in outreach, knowing that you're going to obviously have Bloc members in your target list, and Bloc members will be important for engagement. Always think, what's in it for Quebec? How can you position it for those members to make it interesting for them so that they can bring it back to their constituents, and it can be something that their party can support. And finally, it's also worth noting that the Heritage Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, is himself from Quebec and has a Quebec lens on things as well. So, that's obviously another consideration. But yeah, definitely from power perspective in Parliament, the resurgence of the Bloc is definitely a game changer in terms of how you go about your government relations.
Definitely. I think for anybody working in the arts and culture sector, I think, if you could possibly have a gift in a minority government or receive a gift, this is definitely one. And, from a magazine perspective, there are fabulous French language magazines, a lot of wonderful, strong consumer magazines published in Quebec, many of them published in Montreal. And we know that the minister, I believe, is from a Montreal area riding. So I think we have, I think there's a lot of great opportunity there for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, Listen, thank you so much, Shirley, for joining us today. This has been a really great discussion. We absolutely adore working with Compass Rose Group, and we know that government relations is one of the core services that Magazines Canada brings to its members across the country. We know that preserving, I referred to it as that baseline support from the federal government, whether it's the Canada Periodical Fund or the Canada Council for the Arts. We know, because our members have told us, we have the data, that preserving that critical government support is our members' number one priority. So our number one priority in serving our members, therefore, must be to engage on Parliament Hill. And fortunately for us, we get to work with you guys, and we really love doing it. So thank you, Shirley.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great discussion, and I know we could go on for a long time, but we probably have to cut it off somewhere.
That's right. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review AudioMag on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can follow Magazines Canada on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Mags Canada, and on LinkedIn as Magazines Canada for more magazine news and great resources. So thanks for listening, and thank you again to Shirlee Engel for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we'll have a new episode of AudioMag returning on February 12th. AudioMag is a Magazines Canada podcast produced by Messenger Bag Media. We recognize and are grateful for the support we receive for our professional development resources from the Canada Periodical Fund, administered by the Department of Canadian Heritage.